Hello and welcome. You're watching a very special episode today on Times Now. I'm Siddhartha Talya and it's my honor and privilege to be joined by the chairman of the 16th Finance Commission, a renowned author as well as economist, Dr. Arvind Panagariya. Thank you very much, Dr. Panagariya, for coming to our Times Now studios to talk about the Nehru development model, history and its lasting impact. His latest book, it's a magnum opus on the evolution of India's economic policy from the time of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru to the present. And many congratulations on this very comprehensive work, sir. And I look forward to asking you some pressing questions about some of what you've written in the book, sir.
Thank you, Siddharth. Really pleasure to be here with you. So looking forward to our conversation today.
Well, let me in fact begin this interview, sir, by quoting you from the book. You've said, thanks to the entrenchment of socialist thought in the political, bureaucratic, intellectual and even business constituencies, more than 7 decades after independence, India continues to struggle to fully extricate itself from the Nehru-era economic policy framework. So my question is, what was the fundamental flaw, sir, in that framework, and why has it outlived Nehru for as long as it has?
All right, so this is a very all-encompassing question, Siddharth. To begin with, two important features of Nehru's model were self-sufficiency and socialism. Self-sufficiency is sort of self-explanatory, but in a nutshell, Nehru did not want to be dependent on foreign trade. And so the policy was very much to reorient the economy such that we would not have to export or import products. Certainly minimize exports and imports. Now, so there's one feature. And the second feature was socialism, which translated in the progressively greater ownership of resources, of productive resources by the state, which meant a very progressively enlarging public sector for manufacturing particularly as well. I mean, there are a lot of services that, electricity, water, etc. The state always has to do, but this was more about manufacturing. I think those are the two features which then led to a model which was based on first the development of heavy industry. It is that kind of concentration of capital in the heavy industry with labor actually getting hardly any capital to work with. These are the features that we acquired during that period. And these features continue to be, in a modified form, be with us today. And this is where this quote that you read out comes from.
Well, let's grapple with the roots of Nehru's economic philosophy, what went into shaping his thinking as far as the kind of economic future India should secure is concerned. Now, you write that Nehru's belief that imperialism was the direct result of capitalism led him to place the development of heavy industry on the front burner because he identified this as a principal driver of growth to achieve self-sufficiency and also eradicate poverty. What were some of the reference points internationally that Nehru could have relied on then? We're talking about the late 40s, early 1950s here, including among newly independent nations, because decolonization was very much something that was very active at that point in time, to actually course correct. Did he ever introspect, did he ever realize that perhaps this particular path that he's charting as far as our economic future is concerned may not be ideal?
So it is difficult actually to find any references in his own writings and speeches of the time that he ever thought of alternatives. And this may well have been the result of the fact that he was very much kind of educated in England, and then he returned actually in the late 1920s to England, interacted with a large number of socialists of the day, nationalists from Africa and Asia, and socialists from various countries at a big conference that took place in Brussels during that visit of his. And that, I think, really influenced him very heavily against the background that he had already begun to pick up, actually, being when he was at Cambridge and at Inner Temple as a student. But this Brussels conference around 1927 or it was in 1927, really shaped his thinking. Now, could he have picked up alternative ideas? Certainly, while in the academic and a lot of media circles, socialism was so dominant in England. Even England was not socialist in this sense at the time. And if we had or he had looked at the American experience at the time, clearly that was a different experience. And even, one of the American economists that came around in 1955 when the second five-year plan was being discussed. Milton Friedman, yes, as you say, clearly was not of that view. But the fact that Nehru himself actually and other political leaders of the time, I mean, even actually the leaders who later on, formed the Swatantra Party and all, were not free of the socialist thought around this time. And when the second five-year plan gets discussed, really Swatantra Party is not there. And there is very little opposition. Actually, there is a huge amount of consensus, and that is something I document at great length.
Absolutely. You spoke about some resistance while Sardar Patel was alive, because Sardar Patel had a lot of sympathy for the potential for private enterprise. And of course, when Nehru proposed the idea of collectivization of agriculture, there were people like C. Rajgopalachari, who were, of course, not completely on board with those ideas. But since you mentioned the Swatantra Party, sir, that's a very good segue for me to actually dwell upon a very important parliamentary exchange involving Prime Minister Nehru in 1963 and Meenu Masani, Member of Parliament from the Swatantra Party. And let's in fact quote what Meenu Masani said on the floor of Parliament while challenging Nehru on his economic policy. He said, "I venture to say that while the objective was noble, the method was hopelessly wrong. The method of statism, of state capitalism, of believing that people could do nothing, that government must do everything for them, the carrying on of that Maa-Baap Sarkar, mother-father government mentality of the British Raj, which has been the bane of this country during the past 15 years. That's what Meenu Masani said about the economic policy that Nehru had charted. And yet, Dr. Panagariya, you also write that not many in the opposition then would necessarily have endorsed Mr. Masani himself.
This is very true, actually. And you can see through the debate that he did not have many supporters. And when Nehru responded, actually, at the end, he practically, offhandedly dismissed Meenu Masani. I mean, Meenu Masani sort of even questioned the reliance on heavy industry and all. And Nehru actually in response more or less laughed it out that, what is Mr. Masani talking about, that we should not have heavy industry. And it really ultimately, the kind of statism that Masani is talking about here in this paragraph was the result of the desire to build heavy industry in the first place, build it up front. Eventually all countries which, eventually become capital abundant build heavy industry. But we are not a capital abundant country, we are a labor abundant country. So really, in a way, the path to faster growth in some sense actually lay in making far more effective use of labor. Which we did not do because, we completely left entire labor force either in agriculture or in these very tiny little enterprises. We used to, Nehru even himself actually uses the term hand industries, meaning, something that you do only with hands and hardly any capital. So, when workers don't get any capital to work with, then the skill formation also does not happen. Much of the skill formation really happens to, initially you start working with the simple machinery. Then as you become more capital abundant, more capital becomes available, you go to a somewhat more complex machinery that raises the skill levels. And that is the process which actually leads to ultimately higher and higher skilling of workers. And that's a process actually that worked very well in South Korea, Taiwan later on. But that process does not start till late 50s.
Well, let's come to that because Nehru's economic policies and ideas, of course, outlived him. He died in 1964. But by the time that Indira Gandhi, his daughter, was in power, Asian tigers, like you mentioned, Singapore, South Korea, as well as Taiwan, were embracing a different approach to economic growth. And yet, India moved further to the left, especially between the years 1969 and 1976, in particular with nationalization, the MRTP Act that you dwell upon, the FERA Act, among others. Now, did this particular phase, sir, leave a more lasting legacy and for the worse?
Yes to both, actually, and in a way, naturally, this moved us deeper into the policies that were very restrictive of the private enterprise through labor market policies, through land market policies, nationalization of various industries. All this happened during this period from 1969 to 1976. What the book, however, argues is that, the way socialism had already gripped various constituencies within India, the intellectuals, the politicians, the bureaucrats, even the business interests, it practically became inescapable. We were as if on a predetermined path from which movement away was simply not going to happen easily. And opportunities arose. Indira Gandhi herself, actually, Mrs. Gandhi had to contend with the conservative wing within the Congress, led by Nambudripad, Morarji Desai, etc. Now, even the conservatives of the time were really socialists, but certainly, they were, one would say, a little softer socialists than Mrs. Gandhi was. But in the end, you see, because socialism by that time is so popular among the people, it's the socialist side that wins. So Mrs. Gandhi wins, the conservatives, Morarji Desai, Nambudripad, etc., they lose. And repeatedly, when opportunities come for a change doesn't happen.
Because there's resistance.
Because there is resistance, and there is effectively, it takes a while for a leader to come forward who actually thinks that, socialism is harming us. That happens, when Rajiv Gandhi becomes Prime Minister.
And that speech that he gave, when he actually questioned how socialism was actually, or the interpretation of socialism or the definition of socialism that certain people within his party had, how that was actually impairing our growth as opposed to facilitating it. He brought that transition in thinking. And of course, Narasimha Rao, when he became Prime Minister, initiated some very important economic reforms when his finance minister was Dr. Manmohan Singh. But if we fast forward a bit, sir, to UPA 1, when Dr. Manmohan Singh is now the Prime Minister of India, you do compliment him for bringing in certain reforms, but you're very critical of two other steps. One is, of course, introducing the land acquisition bill, and the other is the right to education. Why do you believe that they are vestiges of the same kind of socialist thought that had originated in Nehru's mind and continued thereafter? And why are they not very welcome as far as securing our economic future is concerned?
So let me just say this. So these were the measures taken under UPA 2. UPA 1 really was kind of okay. They did not do a lot of reforms, but also did not do anything that would sort of, set back economic growth. But
the RTE was 2009, the land acquisition was 2013.
2013, right. And other things also happened during this period. If you look at, we had the retrospective taxation, the environmental clearances on virtually all infrastructure projects came to a complete standstill. So infrastructure projects came completely stuck and all. So now, turning to a specific question you asked about both Land Acquisition Act and Right to Education Act. See, Land Acquisition Act really made incredibly difficult for the sovereign, meaning the government, to acquire land for any public purposes. And of course, even much more so for the private purposes, meaning that if the government is to acquire land under that act for the industry, that's doubly difficult. It also made, the Land Acquisition Act also made land that is acquired, the price of it incredibly high. So all our public projects became very expensive. Today, almost 3/4 of the cost of building roads is the land acquisition cost. Now that of course means that given the resources which are limited, we can build fewer kilometers of road than we would if land that is to be acquired were not so expensive. But even for the industry, it has become very difficult to acquire land on behalf of it. Now, normally, I believe that industry should buy its own land. Anyone who believes in market will say that. But the difficulty in India is that land rights are not well defined. So even if you are trying to acquire, contiguous piece of land which is about 100 acres, let us say, you will end up with pieces within that 100 acres which are under dispute.
Correct.
And so it is very difficult. That is where I think the government has to come in and help the industry a bit to clean up that those pockets of land, parcels of land that are under dispute. So that is about the Land Acquisition Act. Now, Right to Education Act, again, first of all, it in terms of the recognition of the schools, all the requirements that it listed were all about input requirements. Absolutely nothing about the achievements of the students.
Right.
It also did away with the exams completely. Then, as far as the teachers were concerned, it gave them a lot of rights, but no duties. Nothing to discipline the school teachers, even if they are not showing up. So, they are absent from the classes, or when they show up, they decide not to teach. Now, and when the students are not examined, then you can't have any information on the teachers either, right? In a way, whether the students are doing well or not is also a test of whether the teacher is doing well or not.
Correct.
So, these are the kind of issues that were left out. So, Right to Education Act in spirit was a sensible act. I mean, the right, who could be against the right to education? Of course, we are all for it. But in the way the details of the legislation came out,
print, yes.
they carried the vestiges of the socialist thought.
Now, this book is also a lot about how the vestiges of that kind of thinking have remained to this day. You've spoken about certain practices that still prevail or in fact have been revived. You've said that you've in fact been critical of import substitution industrialization's revival under the current dispensation, and also the non-implementation of labor codes that were introduced by this very government. How frustrating is it?
Well, I've been in this business long enough.
Yes.
I started in the 1980s very pessimistically. But once I saw that 1991 happened, and then also when I saw that Prime Minister Vajpayee could build these fantastic roads and highways, the Golden Quadrilateral, etc., my pessimism, both about the ability of the government to carry forward the reforms as well as the ability of the government to build infrastructure vanished. And so, I recognize, having been long enough in this business, that India, things move slowly.
Okay.
That things do happen. Mind you that some of the toughest reforms that I had been writing for almost 20 years. So, one was the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code,
which was brought
in by the Modi government in 2016.
Yes.
Then we also had the Goods and Services Tax.
Correct.
This was such a difficult, such a complex, complicated reform. Got done. So I maintain my optimism. I think labor codes will get notified, and eventually I think we would also therefore begin to solve the problem in a genuine way of the low productivity of labor.
Sure.
Meaning, we need to create good jobs, and that means creating an environment for the labor-intensive industries such as apparel, footwear, furniture, a lot of the light manufacturers to flourish. And I think things have gotten a lot better. especially in the last 10 years, but also during the Narasimha Rao and Atal Bihari Vajpayee eras. And I think going forward, we will see more progress.
Let's also talk about public sector units, public sector entities, also the issue about disinvestment as well. Now, as per one study, there are 389 PSUs, of which 255 are operational. This is as far as central government controlled PSUs are concerned. State governments have their own PSUs. There are approximately 1,451, out of which 300 are not operational. Now, you've yourself advocated the privatization of banks as well. And you've also said that while the private sector has expanded, manufacturing still remains heavily in the public sector. Are you surprised that this hasn't really changed much, despite fairly strong mandates over the last 3 terms that we've seen?
So again, as I said, change happens a bit gradually in India, but we should also recognize the fact that change is sustainable in India. Unlike in China, where we are seeing a great deal of turmoil currently, where a lot of the things that had been done by the earlier premiers of China are being undone. That has not happened in India. So I sort of recognize, as I said, privatization no doubt has been slow, but some progress has been made. So Air India got privatized. There was a big steel plant in Neelachal which got privatized. Now, as you mentioned, there is still very large number of enterprises in the public sector. The government, by the way, also introduced a public enterprise policy under which it has identified strategic sectors and non-strategic sectors, and it has adopted at least the policy is there, framework is there, that in the non-strategic sectors all enterprises will be privatized. Now, this is a much more difficult reform to do for the simple reason that there, these again, even if we move away from the socialist thought, the vested interests that socialism created don't die so easily. So every policy you adopt creates its own vested interest, and that kind of, those vested interests work towards perpetuating that policy. So this will still require some time.
It's very interesting you mentioned vested interests, sir, because another aspect where that is still prevalent, and that's in our negotiations vis-a-vis multilateral as well as bilateral trade treaties. That is something that you've also discussed in the book, where there is a tendency, at least on the part of the bureaucracy, to be overtly protectionist. How big a concern is this, sir?
No, this is a big concern. For any trade economist, it's a big concern. And this is why, we keep writing. And we also see the change. I mean, it's not as though no change has happened. We came from import licensing on everything, and on top, tariff rates that went as high as 355% in 1991 to basically no import licensing. Tariff rates have come down dramatically. They are still a bit high on the high side, and the tendency is towards kind of returning to protecting industries remains. But I think on the whole, the direction of movement is correct. And some of us have to keep pushing a bit harder, and in the negotiation also. On the positive side, of course, we have been able to do agreements with Australia, UAE, EFTA. These are smaller kind of countries. Now we need to do one with UK, and after that one with the European Union. So because of the vested interest, auto interests, liquor industry interests, etc., they're giving a tough fight. And so I think eventually we will get there. I sort of certainly remain optimistic. If we were not optimistic, really, we will not do policy.
And of course, you've also spoken about India's potential to become a $50 trillion economy by 2047 as well. That's something that you've spoken about too, sir. And you remain optimistic. If we can indulge on one final note, if we can indulge in a bit of speculative history here, because during the course of your research, how much of Sardar Patel's economic thinking were you able to kind of come across, and whether or not he would have been able to be an effective counterweight had he lived longer to Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's own economic philosophy as well as ideas? Do you think we would have charted a completely new direction vis-a-vis our economic policy had Sardar Patel been alive?
I'm glad you asked that question, Siddharth, because that is the last chapter of my book,
Yes.
where I go back and pose this hypothetical.
Yes.
Just suppose the age profiles of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel had been switched. So Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru had left this scene in December 1950, and Sardar Patel had lived till May 1964.
Correct.
There I argue that certainly the kind of license permit Raj regime with which we ended up would not have been there. Also, I argue that there is enough in the speeches of Sardar Patel, particularly from 1948, 49, and some in 1950, that he would not have built this very large public sector. He believed in the private enterprise, and his efforts during 1948 and 1949, when a lot of strikes had been happening, a lot of conflict between the industrialists and the workers had been happening, was to bring these together and argue with each that, look, production is the important thing, and neither of you will profit if production doesn't take place. The workers seeking wages, they will not get wages if production is not happening in the first place. So he believed in private enterprise, there is no doubt. Now, whether he would have not gone for heavy industry or would he have been more of a pro-free trade leader, that is a bit harder to say. There's not enough on those aspects to reach this kind of conclusion. But we certainly would have had a very different kind of system.
Of course.
There is a interview by J.R.D. Tata, actually, which I came across after the book had come out, where he actually says this, that had Sardar Patel lived longer, we would have had a very different kind of system. I mean, he's very convinced. And that sort of reinforced my own beliefs, because J.R.D. Tata was somebody who knew both Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel. So he knew them personally. So that interview actually is a very revealing interview, and I was kind of glad to see that he reached the same conclusion that I had.
So this is a wonderful book, a very comprehensive piece of work. Many congratulations once again. It's extremely insightful and a must read for any student of Indian economics. So anyone who even remotely has an interest when it comes to the evolution of India's economic policy, right from independence to the present times. Thank you once again, Dr. Panagariya, for coming to our studio, doing this interview, and it was wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Siddharth. What a great pleasure it is to speak with you.
Thank you, sir.